Hello once again, and welcome to another study in the book of Job. We will be on lesson number 10 on your quarterly. The title of our lesson today is Miserable Comforters. It's dated November 8th of 2020, and we will be looking as our lesson text from Job chapter 2, verse 11, all the way through chapter 31, verse 40. Now, once again, we will not be able to expound upon all these verses of these some 30 chapters. Hope that you will go and you will have time to read these chapters, what's going on here. We will summarize these as the best we can. We'll focus in on chapter number 2, verses 11 through 13. Then we'll look at chapter number 4, a few verses there, and then we'll finish up our study in chapter number 16. Miserable Comforters, lesson number 10, on page number 69 in your quarterly, if you do have one. Once again, if you do not have a quarterly, don't fret. It's okay. We'll lead you through this and tell you and show you where we are. Now, application for today's lesson is that the student will choose to bring real relief to those who are suffering and to offer help without being judgmental. And so what we're talking about today is Job and his three friends that come on the scene. And so we'll be talking about those things today. Now, in chapters 1 and 2 we studied about last week, we were introduced to Job. And we were introduced to Job as a perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. We know that God blessed Job with wealth and health and a loving family. We talked about that last week. Satan was allowed to take away all those things that he had there. Yet according to verse number 22 in chapter number 1, it says, "In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly." So when he had his wealth, his health, and his loving family, he was perfect and sinned not, and didn't charge God foolishly. And then after all those things were taken away from him, his stand with God did not change. Now, his stand here on earth and those things the physical possessions that he had here on earth, and those things changed, of course, but his love for God, his trust in God did not change. And so we must have an understanding of that. And this is kind of what he's going to go through with these so-called friends he has here. And they were friends, but they were just misguided. And we're going to talk about that today. Now, no doubt the word of Job's losses that he had made its way through the land very quickly. He was very well known, very wealthy, had many servants, had a large family, many animals. People knew who Job was. There's no doubt about that. So when all this took place, when he lost all these things, no doubt the land, those people around in that land, in that area, heard about it rather quickly. Now, 3 of Job's friends, we're going to talk about them today, they come to see him, to comfort him. However, they do more sermonizing than sympathizing. More sermonizing than sympathizing. And what they did, they offered much advice and little love, is what these friends, I think their intentions were great when they came on the scene. They had good intentions. However, it changed. So they offered much advice and little love and support. Love and support is what Job needed at this time from his friends, and he got very little of it. The love and support would have truly helped him in his time of trouble. But we know through this, and we'll find it through this study, that that's not what he gets. Now, today's lesson is a perfect example of how not to counsel one who is suffering. So may we find out today a little bit better, having a little bit better idea of if we have friends that are truly suffering loss or suffering hardships, then we can learn from the actions of Job and his friends of how to support our friends in need and how not to. And so we hope we can glean that today as well, and provide real relief to our friends that are suffering, instead of being judgmental to them and trying to get our way and steer them away from God, so to speak here. So with that being said, We do have three parts. Like I said before, we're going to be in chapter number 2, and we're going to talk about Job's friends come to him, and then we're going to look over at chapter number 4. Job's friends accuse him. We're also going to speak a little bit about chapter number 3, and then we'll finish up. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll finish up our lesson today in chapter 16 with miserable comforters is what Job calls them. So with that being said, let's dive right into the Word of God and see where Holy Spirit leads us once again. We are in chapter number 2, verses 11 through 13. Job's friends come to him. Now, this is after he has lost all his possessions, lost his family. It's just he and his wife, and we know of the 3 or 4 servants that made it, plus the servants that were there. All of his cattle, camels, all those things were gone. And now he is in mourning, in a state of mourning. And so we find out now that his friends has come on the scene. So in verse number 11 of chapter number 2, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, we must understand that that's not probably the only friends that Job had, but no doubt these were probably considered close friends of Job. When these 3 friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place. And he gives the names and where these fellows were from. And we won't dive into who these guys were or what part of the country they were from, because it's under much speculation of where these places were, just like where the land of Uz was. But they had Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes afar off and knew him not, they lifted up their voice and wept. And they rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Now, in verse number 11, each of Job's 3 friends debates on why Job's losses and sufferings had come upon him. Now, it was according to verse number 11, we know that they met beforehand, and then they all came and came upon and seen Job at the same time. So they met before and arrived at the same time. They came to Job with the right intentions. We spoke of that. Which was what was their original intentions, according to verse number 11. They were come to mourn with him and to comfort him. They were there as friends to be with Job during this hard time. And I'm telling you what, I've seen folks in the hospital where they're laying up in the hospital bed and they're on the brink of passing away. And I walked in on a friend of mine and was visiting years ago, and one of his best friends was in the room. The lights were off, and he was just sitting there. The fellow was in the bed, just sleeping, and his friend, one of his best friends, was there. And I asked him what he was doing. He goes, "I'm just here." And he had not woken up, and so we were very quiet. Eventually, he did wake up. We spoke with him, but his one of his best friends, he said, "I've been sitting here about an hour. I'm just here for him." And what a blessing, man, that was to me. Just thinking about that now, just kind of gets me going there. But we need friends that'll just be there for us. And so these friends, they come together, and their original intentions was to mourn with him and to comfort their friend Job. That's what their intentions were, according to verse number 11. However, it quickly turns into what? Well, if you've read these 30-something chapters, you're going to find out that it quickly turns into accusations and sermons. And so we see here in verse number 12, when his friends came upon his land, and got closer to his home and closer, and they actually laid their eyes on Job. They had to realize that Job has been in mourning. We don't know for exactly how long, how many days he had been in mourning, but he also had boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. So he'd been in sackcloth and ashes, been scraping those boils. And so what had happened here? He was completely unrecognizable to them. His friends didn't even recognize Job because he was in such bad shape. What does his friends do? His friends mourn with him. They weep. They rent their mantle, and they sprinkle the dust upon their heads just as Job did. Now all this, the sprinkling of dust and renting their mantle, ripping their coats, was a common outward expression of mourning during this time. And this is what Job had been doing. So what did they do? In verse number 13, Job didn't say a word. They sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights and did not say a word. They just sat with Job. Why? Because it says in verse number 13, for they saw that his grief was very great. What are you going to say? What can you do? You can just be there for him. So that's what they did for 7 days and 7 nights. They didn't say a word. They just sat with their friend. And evidently the pain of Job was felt by his friends. His friends felt his pain, and they wanted to be there for him, and they mourned with him, and they just sat with him and was there for him. When Job decided to speak, they would be there for him. And we find out in chapter number 3, it's not part of our focus here, but in chapter number 3, we find out that Job is the first one to speak. And that was the custom at that time. If you was coming in to mourn with someone, you would allow those to speak first. It's not necessarily a custom nowadays, but it is good practice. If you have a friend that is mourning, it's better off a lot of times, most of the time, not to say a word. Just be there. About the only thing you can say is, I'm praying for you, and then begin to pray. And just be there for them. So this is what the friends did. They were there for him and didn't say a word for all these 7 days and 7 nights. Now we also understand in chapter number 3 that when Job began to speak, we must understand that during all this, Job did not sin against God, and he did not charge God foolishly. So he didn't blame God, and he didn't sin as far as charging God foolishly or blaming God for this, for what was going on. Now we must understand that Job was still in a state of mourning, and people mourn in all kind of different ways. But we must understand that Job, through all of this, whatever he said, whatever he did not sin against God in his mourning. But we do find that in chapter number 3 that Job did curse the day. He did not curse God. He cursed the day. However, he never cursed God, and he had 3 wishes, according to chapter number 3. The 3 wishes he had was that he had never been born. You got to realize he's in mourning. He had never been born. He also wished that he had died at birth, and he'd also wished that he could die right now. That's what he spoke of in chapter number 3. Yet he never sinned against God. He was mourning. All right, so we must have an understanding of that. So now what we get an idea is his friends took all of what Job spoke. Like I said, they didn't say a word, let Job speak first, but now it's their turn to speak. And boy, did they speak. They said a lot, they spoke a lot of words and said a bunch of nothing, is what they really, really did. So we'll pick up in chapter number 4 and just get a start of what, we're not going to be able to dive into the details of everything that the friends said, but let's just read chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, so once Job had spoken, then the first friend, Eliphaz the Temanite, answered and said, if we essay to commune with thee, wilt thou be grieved? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. So far, so good, right? Thy words have upholden him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. So Job was a man of comfort. He was a good friend. But in verse number 5, it begins, but now it is come upon thee, and thou faintest. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Is not this thy fear, thy confidence, thy hope, and the uprightness of thy ways? Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished, being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? So you see that it changed very quickly here, just from the first friend, this Eliphaz the Temanite. So chapter 4 begins the dialogue. It turns into a debate, what it turns into, but it's a dialogue, a debate between his friends and Job. And it continues all the way through the end of chapter number 31. So many chapters there, some 30 chapters of this debate, this dialogue between Job and his friends. So now in chapters 4 through 7, and also chapters 15 through 17, and also in chapters 22 through 24, we see the dialogue between Job and Eliphaz. So Job would speak, Eliphaz would answer, and then maybe then Job again would speak, and Eliphaz would answer. And they did that 3 times, 3 different dialogues there in the chapters that we just spoke of. Now in chapters 8 through 10, and chapters 18 through 19, and chapters 25 through 31, his friend Bildad did the same thing, had the dialogue. Job would speak, Bildad would answer, Job would speak again, Bildad would answer, and then Job would answer again. So this is how these things went back and forth with this dialogue throughout all these chapters. And then we find out in chapters 11 through 14, and also chapters 20 through 21, his third friend Zophar has the dialogue with Job, his friend. Now, so in a nutshell, what are these friends basing all of their accusations on, or all of their arguments on? Well, Eliphaz, in a nutshell, the first friend bases all of his arguments on mystical visions and personal experience. This is what Eliphaz, if you want to tie it all together, this is what Eliphaz spoke of. And then Bildad comes on the scene. He bases his arguments on traditions. And then you look at Zophar. Zophar bases all of his arguments on his own personal opinion. So they had different ideas, each one of his friends there, basing their arguments on, but they all agreed on one thing. All of his friends agreed on one thing. And that was that ultimately Job had lost all these things and was suffering because there was sin in his life. That's what they all based it on. So it was all in a nutshell. Now we know that not to be true. His friends didn't know that. His friends truly believed, Job, you have some unconfessed sin in your life and you need to confess it. You need to repent. You need to get right with God, and then God will bless you again. Job knew all along that was not the case. Job knew all along that was not the case. His friends did not. The reason we know that is because I pointed it out in the first of the lesson that in chapter 1, verse 22 states that in all this is the fact that he lost everything, and then all this also includes his discussions with his friends. So before or after or during, Job never blamed God. He never accused God. He never sinned. He mourned. He never sinned. Because it says there in chapter 1, verse 22, that in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. So his friends didn't understand. His friends thought they had the answers to all things, and truly thought that Job, even though he was a great man of God, he had some unconfessed sin, and God had called him on the carpet about it, and God had taken away all of his possessions and killed his family because of an unconfessed sin in his life. So what does Job do? Well, we're going to be in our next part of our and the final part in our lesson today is found in Job chapter 16, and we're looking at the first 7 verses. It's very interesting verses here of kind of what Job thinks about all the arguments and what he thinks about his friends here in chapter number 16. Listen to these words. Then Job answered and said, now this is one of the answers that Job is doing to one of the friends there, specifically there, I believe it is Eliphaz. He's answering, but in chapter 16, he says, then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things, then the colon, ... So, miserable comforters are ye all. So he said, I've heard many things, change of direction, change of thinking here, change of their miserable comforters are ye all. Shall vain words have an end? Or what emboldeneth thee that thou answerest? I also could speak as ye do. If your soul were in my soul's stead, I could heap up words against you, and shake mine head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the moving of my lips should assuage your grief. Though I speak, my grief is not assuaged. And though I forbear, what am I eased? But now he hath made me weary. Thou hast made desolate on my company. These verses sums up what Job thinks of their preaching that he's listening to. In verse number 2, he calls them miserable comforters. Miserable. This miserable is troublesome, wearisome. Let me tell you something. Job had enough trouble, and he had enough weary. He was weary enough. I mean, he didn't need any more piled on, and this is all that his friends did, was piled on more trouble and made him more weary. This is what he called him miserable. Now, a comforter, what is a comforter to do? A comforter is one who brings consolation and compassion to another. So they were miserable comforters. They added trouble. They added the wearisome to Job. They did not bring any consolation. They did not bring any compassion with them. Now, verse number 3. Shall vain words have an end, or what emboldeneth thee that thou answerest? At this point, comfort had been thrown out the window. Now all they wanted was to win an argument, it seemed. It seemed all they wanted to do was win an argument. They wanted Job to admit to something that was not true. They wanted Job to admit to some sin in his life that they knew was there. They didn't know what it was, but they just knew it was there. And Job, you just need to confess it. And you need to get right with God. So they were trying to win an argument. Now, they were no longer being comforters. I don't know if they ever were comforters. The only time they were truly comforters probably was in the 7 days and 7 nights when they didn't say a word. That was the only time that there was a comfort to Job. Now, the argument was, they believe, once again, I've talked about this, that all the suffering is caused by a certain sin in one's life. And there's still people that believe that today. Sin is sin. I'm not under the belief that there is certain sins that we just specifically pay for in a specific way. Sin is sin, and we must pay for them all. And so this is what these friends here was talking about. The only reason that he was being judged was because of a specific sin in his life that he had maybe that was unconfessed. So in verse number 4, Job states that if the shoe was on the other foot, he could speak as they did. So he says there in verse number 4, I also could speak as ye do, if your soul were in my soul's stead. So if you were in my shoes, I could speak the same way to you. I could not bring you any comfort. I could accuse you of some unconfessed sin. This is what I could do. But verse number 5 says, but however, he didn't do that. However, he said, I wouldn't do that. What he would do, he said, if you were in my shoes, I would strengthen them. I would strengthen you, and my words would assuage your grief. What is this assuage? This assuage means to darken as to withhold light. What they were doing was trying to shed light on his sufferings. They were trying to shed light on a certain sin that didn't exist. And Job said, I would not do that. I would dim that light. I would try my best to make you have an understanding that you're going to get through this troubles. I would dim the lights, if you will, on your suffering. I would not bring light to them. This is what Job is saying. His words would assuage your grief, and it means to darken or to withhold light. A friend's words should always lessen the intensity of their grief. Like Job didn't have enough problems, now he's got 3 friends that are accusing him and just piling on more grief upon Job. What a terrible time in Job's life. It could have been a great time for his 3 friends to come there and just truly comfort him and get him over the wall of that grief. But it's not what happened. They piled more grief on top of him. These friends, according to verses 6 and 7, these friends came to comfort Job. However, they had not only failed, but were the worst kind of comforters. The worst kind of comforters. So may we learn how we are to comfort our friends that are in need. Now, next week, we're going to be introduced to a young man named Elihu, and he's going to come on the scene. He's going to offer some words of chastisement, and he's also going to offer some words of wisdom that we'll find out in our next lesson. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope it's helped you have a little bit better understanding of Job And I encourage you to go and read all these chapters. Read the dialogue between his friends and make it a lot more clear for you. And with that being said, I hope you have a great day and God truly blesses you.